everybody. Welcome to another edition of The Lighter Side of True Crime. I'm your host, Keith Rovere. Today, I just feel so lucky, so blessed to have Dr. Terry Kupers on the show. Anytime I do research on the effects from solitary confinement on the mind and what kind of just a mental trauma that happens when people come out, even doing a short time in solitary confinement, let alone sometimes years and decades in there. His name is always on top of the list, giving quotes, articles, books, lectures. It's amazing. I quote him without even realizing I'm quoting him. His newest book, Ending Isolation, The Case Against Solitary Confinement. I think there's a few authors in that book. Great, just an amazing read. Prison Madness, The Mental Health Crisis Behind Bars and What We Must Do About It. And Solitary, The Inside Story of Supermax Isolation and How We Can Abolish It. I mean, that's the main question. How do we abolish it? When you hear just the stories that he's going to tell from men and women who spent upwards of 30 to 40 years in solitary confinement. Now, I think most of us with a pure, healthy mind can barely make it a night in solitary. Then you force somebody to spend decades and years in solitary confinement, sometimes for no reason at all, except for maybe looking at the guard wrong. And what can we do about it? How can we bring about change? What can we do as individuals? What the politicians can do? What as a community we can do? There's a lot. I mean, we're barely going to scratch the surface of this. I jokingly say, that I can have somebody like him on every week, and we'll still not scratch the surface of everything. So anyway, without further ado, let's hear it from Dr. Terry.
I'm all yours.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for taking the time.
Sure.
I know you're a busy guy. I think you're hopping on a plane in a couple of days, so I really appreciate it.
I take on a case, and then for 2 or 3 years, I don't hear from the lawyers, and it goes around and around in summary judgment, and then all of a sudden they call and they say, well, we're going to trial. And that's what's going on. This happens to be a busy time of year for trials.
I can imagine. It's funny. I mean, every time I do research or I look online for like mental health issues from prison and solitary confinement, your name is everywhere. I've quoted you. I've seen your lectures and from the books. For you, where did this all start? I mean, you're a doctor. You have degrees, but what was really caught your attention? Where, wow, I need to bring attention to this. These atrocities that are happening in different prisons across the country.
Well, that's basically the second step. The first step is that I got asked to come in and look around. And that happened because in the 60s, I was very active in the civil rights movement. I was a radical activist. And I worked as the doctor. I directed the Black Panther Party's free clinic in Los Angeles.
Wow.
In South Central Los Angeles. They owned a building, the Black Panther Party. They lived in upstairs and had an office upstairs, and 13 people lived there. Downstairs, we used for my clinic. It was called the Bunchy Carter Clinic.
Okay.
About 1970, the FBI, they had something called COINTELPRO, which was an intelligence. It was a federal government support for local police. And they helped the LA Police Department. They invaded the Panther office, and they were going to wipe them out.
Wow.
So everybody that was active in civil rights was called in the middle of the night, and everybody scrambled down to the Panther office to watch so that they wouldn't just kill all the Panthers. So they wounded them, and there were 13 Panthers with bullet wounds and beaten up and such. And they took them to the jail hospital.
Mm-hmm.
There was a law in California that if you were locked up in jail, your doctor could come and participate in your treatment. So the Panthers had been coming to the free clinic. It was downstairs from where they were living. So they got their medical care from me at the free clinic. So I went to the jail and I said, I'm here to see my patients. They said, who's that? And I gave them a list of 13 of the Black Panthers. And they said, you can't see them. They're on high security. And I said, yes, I can. And there were lawyers with me from the Lawyers Guild and various other groups. And they got me in to see them. I talked about the awful care they were getting. There were police everywhere. They were hitting them where they were wounded. Their IVs weren't working. And I came out and we did a press conference and I exposed that kind of treatment. About a year later, now this is right when I'm finishing my training as a psychiatrist. So I'm a young psychiatrist working in the community in my day job. And the ACLU came to me and said, would you be our expert witness were doing
Wow.
a lawsuit against the LA sheriff and the LA County Jail. And I said, I don't know anything about testifying in court, and I don't know anything about jails. They said, that's okay. This is a new kind of litigation. Nobody else does that anyway. And we just want you to go back in there and do for all the people in the jail what you did for the Black Panthers. I said, okay, I can do that. So I did, and I came to court and I talked about the terrible conditions. In those days, crowding was the issue, and the jail was massively overcrowding. So there'd be 3 or 4 prisoners in a cell built for 2. One would be sleeping on the floor. They were sleeping on the tables in the day room, etc. And there was a lot of mental illness, a lot of people with untreated severe psychosis, depression, etc. So I reported on that in court. And from then on, people would contact the attorneys and said, who was your expert in that lawsuit? And they'd tell them that it was me, and then I'd get asked to do other lawsuits. So while I did a general psychiatry practice, I taught, I worked in the hospital, but as an aside, I was doing forensic psychiatry and testifying about jail and prison conditions. That's how it started.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, speaking of where it started, from the book, I guess the new book now, The Ending Isolation, The Case Against Solitary Confinement, something I did not know, that right down the street, about half hour away, Eastern State Penitentiary, I think that was the first place for solitary confinement, I believe in the late 1800s. And how did that come about? And I think, like, reading the book, something like the Quakers were involved in it too. Like, what was the initial purpose of it? What was the reasoning?
Absolutely. It was a good idea that went wrong. The Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia was the actual first place, and the Quakers were involved. Benjamin Franklin was involved. And they had an idea of penitence, and that's where the word penitentiary comes from, that you put someone alone in a cell and give them the responsibility to think about where they'd gone wrong and why they did something that was a criminal action. And the warden would come and talk to them each day and say, how's it going? Have you figured out how you went on such a bad path and what you can do better? And that was the Quakers' idea of penitence. Eastern is a prison in Pennsylvania. It's closed now, but it's a museum now. But then it was a big prison. And they started doing the same thing, also with Quaker influence. In a very short time, the program where they were doing this, the solitary confinement program, basically, got overcrowded, and they started putting more and more people in the program. So the warden couldn't come and visit everybody every day. There tended to be more isolation. They were alone. They didn't have contact with anyone. And they started developing very severe psychiatric symptoms and disabilities. So by the 1890s, the U.S. Supreme Court gave a ruling that said that solitary confinement causes psychosis and it should not be practiced in the prisons.
Wow. I think even Charles Dickens was involved, or he heard about it, or visited, or wrote about it, and so it was pretty well known that this is not a good idea.
Yes, there's a lot of very graphic writings of the time. Charles Dickens did some of them. De Tocqueville came and visited the United States and wrote about solitary confinement and Eastern Penitentiary. So yes, it got to be known as a very big problem. As I said, I started testifying about the ill effects of crowding in the jails and prisons. There was a lot of crowding by the 1970s when I started doing this work. And crowding, we knew from a lot of research, is correlated with an increase of violence, an increase of rule breaking, an increase of psychotic decompensation, and an increase in suicide. So I would testify about those things in court during that first 10 or 15 years of my forensic psychiatry career. But then by the 80s, and this is, I think, in effect, the World War II economic boom in the United States was dying out. The money became less available. Public education was in trouble. The public social welfare safety net programs were being defunded. So by the 1980s and Reagan's tenure, um, we were having massive expansion of the prison population by double and triple of what it had been. And the
Mhm.
crowding was totally out of control. And there was violence in the prisons around the country. So the authorities were looking for a solution to the enhanced violence in the prisons. And they decided, we told them, me and other experts like myself, psychiatrists, sociologists, we said, the problem is the crowding. Crowding is correlated with increased violence. You should look at your sentencing laws and reform sentencing so that people don't go to prison for so long and
Mhm.
reduce the population and provide more rehabilitation programs. That's what we said. They said,
Uh,
you're an idealist. We don't need that. We know what we're going to do. We're going to put everybody in solitary confinement. And that's what they started doing.
uh,
That was the advent of the Supermax prison. I then became an expert on solitary confinement because that's what I was
mhm.
finding when I went into the prisons. So I started studying the subject. And by the mid 80s, certainly into the 90s, I was becoming selectively an expert on solitary confinement.
Wow. Now, I know, like I guess it's not too after you said they initially started the solitary in Pennsylvania. They kind of went dormant because they realized they kind of almost shut it down. But it seems like around that time, like the mid '90s, was that the reason they started bringing it back? They try to justify it under overcrowding, or is there another reason, or did it go away completely, or was it always around? Because I thought it went away, and then like in the mid to '90s, they brought it back, but under maybe a different name or just justification or so.
You're exactly right. Solitary confinement has been with us actually for centuries. We focus on the early Pennsylvania experience in the latter part of the 18th century, but people had been doing that previously. Prisoners of war were always kept in solitary confinement. Interestingly, wherever anybody studied the effects of solitary confinement, they found that it caused psychosis, suicide, and various other psychiatric symptoms. But that research, it was disorganized research, was not public. It wasn't well publicized. So every time there were crises in the prison system, too much violence, too little programming, they would resort to solitary again. So there are
Yeah.
waves of solitary confinement. But the expansion of solitary within the prisons and jails in the 1990s was unprecedented in scope. It became the way that things were done. 40 some states built supermax prisons, which was prisons that specialized in solitary
Yeah.
confinement. Everyone
Mm-hmm.
was alone in a cell, sometimes with a cellmate, and that could be worse, but it was all isolation cells. And
Yeah.
that was the beginning of a mass expansion of solitary confinement. By the 2010s, there's been a concerted effort to reduce the amount of solitary because the harmful effects have become well known.
Yeah. It's funny. Well, it's not funny. It's sad. But I guess I started in my mid 20s when I started, like, I guess through a prison ministry, then outreach, then aftercare. And when I first started, I always thought hearing these horrible stories about general population and the gangs. I'm like, man, I wish if I was getting to prison, I would want to go to solitary. I don't want to be around everybody. I'd bring my book and read. And the more I got to know these people, are like, you would think that, but we would bring a book too. Or a lot of guys with their Bibles, it was a ministry, and try to write. But they said not too soon after, they're looking at the words, but it's like there's so many thoughts in their brain. They said they felt like they're losing their mind. They can't focus on the words, or they try to read and just to write something. And they write a little bit or read a little bit. Either they instantly forgot what they wrote, or what they were going to write, or what they read. And I think it was one of the lectures I saw. What was his name? I believe. I think his name was Miles. And you remember the story of Miles, where he was like trying. I think he said as he was trying to read, he wrote notes down to
That,
himself.
that's right.
This,
That's
Mhm.
something not just Miles, but I hear that from prisoners around the country.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Is it, I say to them when I meet them, I'm sort of a little shocked by the sternness of the conditions. And I said, if I had to survive in here, I think I would read everything I can get a hold of and write to everybody I knew. And they respond. Miles and everyone else responds, I can't do that because I can't remember what I read the page before.
Yeah.
Or when I'm
Mm-hmm.
writing, I can't keep track of what I've been saying because my memory slips and my concentration slips. So those are two of the main symptoms of solitary confinement is very strong memory problems and concentration problems, which
Mm.
makes it very difficult to be productive. You're sitting alone in a cell, there's nothing to do. You've got a bunk of some kind. Sometimes it's just a concrete slab and a toilet sink fixture. And there's
Mm.
nothing to do. There's no equipment to do anything, and you can't talk to anybody. So
Yeah.
reading and writing becomes one of the only things that's possible to do. Take that away, and you're just really in trouble because
Yeah.
people are social animals and they're productive animals. People need to do something meaningful to maintain
Yeah.
their mental stability. So if you
Yeah.
take away their social interaction and all forms of meaningful activity, uh, they lose their minds in one way or another.
Mhm.
And that's the subject
Yeah.
I've been studying since I started looking into solitary confinement.
Now, what are other some of obviously with the memory, but what are other some of the mental health issues that you know for a fact that you studied over the years that the ramifications of that long term, especially I mean, there's some 20 and 30 years in solitary, let alone short term, and whatever they are, is it any of that permanent, or can with proper treatment, and is it all reversible, or are we talking long term, like forever damage that these institutions are causing?
All very good questions, all relevant to the issue of solitary confinement. Unfortunately, it's very long term effects. What
Yeah.
we see, Craig Haney, Stuart Gracian, Pablo Stewart, and various people have researched this. Hans Tock was one of the pioneer researchers. We go in and we talk to prisoners, and a certain proportion of them are in solitary confinement. When we ask them what they're feeling, or we give them a series of feelings and say, is this prominent for you? Anxiety is marked sky high. So
Yeah.
80 or 90% of people in solitary confinement say that their anxiety is extreme and often takes the form of panic attacks. Thinking disorders, they become confused in their thinking. They're unable to continue a line of logic. And paranoia is very prominent. The concentration and memory symptoms are very common. They tell me that they do compulsive activities, either counting the cinder blocks repetitively or
Mm.
counting the blocks on the floor or cleaning their cell multiple times a day. And they think, and I think they're absolutely right about this, that it's a attempt. It's not very successful, but it's an attempt to control the anxiety. And then there's
Mm.
despair. I have people in solitary confinement that I'm interviewing tell me I'm never going to get out of here. And I look at their record and I see that they're assigned to 1 month in solitary confinement or 6 months or maybe a year. I mean, it varies from one place to another. And I say, well, your record says that you're assigned here for 3 months or for 6 months. So why do you think you'll never get out? And they say, well, first of all, I get so anxious and agitated, and I get angry. That's another symptom. People get angry, and it's a very irrational anger. It's not related to anything going on, that I will get into trouble with the officers. They'll write me another ticket, and I'll have another 6 months in
Yeah.
solitary, and that'll go on forever. So I'll just die in here. Now,
Yeah.
that's a reality based fear because it's quite likely that's true,
Yeah.
but also it's a bit of a distorted way of thinking about what's left in life. It's a despairing way to think about it. But that's what people think in solitary confinement. And that kind of despair leads to a lot of suicides. The other thing besides suicide is self harm. People cut
Yeah.
themselves, for
Mhm.
instance. Cutting is something we see, it's very prominent among teenage girls, but
Mhm.
rarely do we see it in adult men, except for the one setting, which is solitary confinement. And it's pretty
Wow.
much epidemic in the United States in solitary confinement units in our jails, prisons, and ICE detention facilities. So we get all of those symptoms in relatively healthy people. People who, if I had examined them when they entered solitary, I would say there's nothing wrong with them. Their mental health is perfectly stable and normal, but they
Wow.
fall apart in all the ways I've just described. The rate of suicide is very high.
Yeah.
Suicide is very prominent in prison. It's several
Mm.
times higher than in the community at large, but well over 50%, and now there's a lot of research showing 60% of prison suicides occur in solitary confinement settings. So this is all in people who, to start with, were relatively stable. Now, if someone has a mental illness, I'm talking about schizophrenia, other forms of
Oh, yeah.
psychosis, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, what we know from a great deal of research is that the solitary confinement exacerbates the mental illness. It makes sense. If I just mentioned paranoia as one of the symptoms for relatively stable people, if you have an environmental stress factor that induces paranoia in relatively stable people, someone who is prone to a psychotic episode, for instance, schizophrenia with repeated psychotic episodes, that person is probably going to have a psychotic episode. So the paranoia that the solitary situation creates in someone who prone to the mental illness that's characterized by psychotic episodes is going to have their mental illness exacerbated. Same
Mm.
with depression. If someone is prone to depression or has a previous record of suicide, the sense of hopelessness, I'm never going to get out of here, there's nothing I can do that's meaningful in my life, I need people to talk to, they're never going to let me talk to anybody, and then they decide to take their own life. And that's a great tragedy. So that's why we have 60% of prison suicides happen in solitary confinement. There's only about 5% of the population in solitary. So that's an extraordinary statistical finding.
And the sad part is, even if they get back out to regular population, it's not like they're getting the health care they need. They're treating themselves from what happened in solitary. I mean, there's a big myth. I mean, I'm sure you hear all the time that, well, I'm glad so and so is off the street. They're in prison. They're getting the help that they need. And even more so with addicts. Oh, he's an addict. Oh, he'll go through a good program in prison from his addiction. In my experience, most people have an addiction problem for some kind of petty crime to go into prison, and they're going to be out, fairly soon, within like 5 to 10 years. But is it your experience that most, even treatment in general, doesn't exist in most prisons? Like if you go in an addict, you're probably leaving an addict. I mean, realistically. I mean, have you noticed that some facilities, I know some have better health care than others, some mental health care than others, but for the most part, do you see that even in the population, a regular part of the prison, they're not getting the health care, the mental health, the treatment, the counseling that they need? So once they come out of solitary, it's almost like they're fending for themselves.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. And all of what you've said is true. Now, solitary itself causes long lasting effects.
Yeah.
I've called it the decimation of life skills. That is,
Oh,
if you
that's good.
leave someone socially isolated where they can't, they talk to the guards who come and give them their food tray, they pass it through a slot in the door. That's not human communication. They probably grunt, or the guard might say, "How you doing?" and someone says, "Fine," but it's not a conversation. So they're entirely socially isolated. They're idle. They can't do anything productive, and that causes changes in the brain. We've been studying that. There are changes in the brain. They also lose the skill of of proceeding with social relationships. So I think one of the most frequent complaints I get from the partners of people who've spent time in solitary confinement when they come home from prison is, "I can't find him. I don't know what's on his
Mm-hmm.
mind. He's unable to tell me. I don't know what he's feeling. He just will not share his feelings." And then what happens is that the habit of being isolated and idle causes them to close down even further, so that
Wow.
they then are not capable of what we consider sort of the usual social relationship, even when they're in the free world. There are reasons for that, and one is just the loss of the skill from the habitual isolation and idleness causes lasting symptoms. But
Yeah.
there are brain correlates. If you study people with, for instance, PET scans, photon emission tomography, or functional MRIs, what we see is certain patterns in the brain And interestingly, they're the same patterns we see in returning veterans from Iraq and
Yeah.
Afghanistan, for instance, if you do those
Wow.
tests. And they do that at the VA. That's why we know that. But what you find is excessive activity in the part of the brain. It's the temporal lobe. It's outside
Mm-hmm.
what we think of as the temple of our skull, and it's called the limbic system. And it tends to get very active with a lot of neurotransmission when we're feeling severe emotions, particularly anger or fear. So the fight flight reaction from psychology textbooks, that is mediated by the temporal lobe. It's where feelings are initiated and
Mm.
activated. Then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is right over the eyes or behind the forehead. And the prefrontal cortex is the site of our rationality, our judgment, our morality, our executive function, etc. And in normal human experience, there's a balance between the temporal lobe and the prefrontal cortex. So the emotions are stimulated in the temporal lobe. That activates the prefrontal cortex, where we say things to ourselves. For instance, I'm getting angry. Should I express my anger? Or should I hit this guy that I'm facing? And we have a conversation with ourselves where in the usual circumstance, in what we call executive function, we'll decide, I'm just going to sit on my anger and I'm not going to let it mess up this event I'm a part of. That capacity to sort of modulate affect and make rational decisions about how to behave is diminished in
Mm.
solitary confinement. It's just something in the brain
Wow.
happens that ability to do that is just diminished, while the power of emotions is increased, so that the person becomes more prone to act out emotions without thinking carefully about repercussions, for instance. There's one
Wow.
change. The brain is a very complicated organ, and there's many changes that we see in the brain imaging that we do, but there's one big one. So that explains why when people get out of solitary, brain changes take a while to happen, but also last a long time. So it's changes. Think about it like a rut in a road during the rainy season. The rut gets deeper and deeper as cars and trucks pass through in the rainy season, and the rut becomes more
Mm.
enlarged or strengthened. That's true in neural pathways in the brain. So when the temporal lobe is activated with strong emotions like anger and fear, that becomes habitual. And then it's hard to reverse that. And when the prefrontal cortex becomes diminished in neurotransmission, that becomes habitual. So the
Mm.
person gets out and it's like they have a chip on their shoulder. They anger very
Mm.
rapidly and they're unable to participate in peaceful, negotiation when there's differences. So those
Wow.
kind of things are long-lasting changes. They're not a mental illness. The loss of skills in terms of settling differences peacefully is not is that there's no
Yeah.
diagnosis that describes that.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
that's the leftover disability from being in solitary confinement. So what we see when people get out, I've written about the SHU post-release syndrome. SHU is an acronym for solitary confinement. It
Mm.
comes from California's security housing units, which is
Mm-hmm.
what the supermax solitary confinement units are called. So
Mm-hmm.
SHU post-release syndrome is a collection of symptoms that we see in people after they get out of solitary. Either they go to the prison general population or they're released from prison. Some people are released straight out of solitary confinement with
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
sort of debriefing or preparation to be in social
Yeah.
communication again. They have a lot of symptoms. First
Yeah.
symptom is they crave isolation. It's
Mm. Makes
paradoxical. It's
sense.
hard to understand. But people who've been in isolation for a long time, you take them out of isolation, First thing they do is hide in their cell or hide in their room at home if they've been released from prison.
Wow.
They're terrified of social interactions, particularly with people they don't know.
Wow.
They're hyper alert. They have a strong startle reaction. They have the same concentration and memory problems as they had when they were in solitary confinement. So there's a whole list of symptoms which do not prepare them well for success in the straight world
No.
at going straight.
Now, well, based on the question I was going to ask you, already you touched on it. That I've known a few people, and I've read so many horror stories. When you're in isolation from solitary for a long, extended period of time, sometimes years, and then get released from prison to the free world. Speaking of suicide rate, I heard that rate is pretty astronomical. Almost the highest that I heard was a close to 70% suicide rate. If you spend more than a couple years in solitary and then get released to the streets, is it truly that high of a number as far as suicide?
I can't say that quantitatively. I don't know of studies that have said that it was that high, but it is high. And
It's a problem, basically. Yeah. What number is it?
yes,
It's
we
there.
have some very good research that looks at death from all causes. That is, it could be a heart attack, it could be a suicide, it could be violence on the street. And what the statistics are is that the rate of mortality in the first year after leaving prison
Hmm.
is much higher for people who have been in solitary confinement for
Yeah.
all causes than it is for
Yeah.
people who have been in prison but have not been in solitary confinement.
Sure.
So
Makes sense.
that's a very disturbing symptom that
Yeah.
basically we're creating situations. People who have been in prison don't live a long time anyway. There's
Yeah.
research that shows with various medical conditions, all of which get worse when one is in prison, that every year in prison takes 2 years off of one's life expectancy.
Oh, wow.
So it's
That's
a
something.
very big problem, and absolutely, suicide is a huge problem. I am involved in social movements where formerly incarcerated people are very active. For instance, Unlock the Box, which is a national organization, is lobbying to get laws in the states and the federal government to limit the amount of solitary confinement, so to limit the time
Okay.
one can be in solitary confinement to 15 days.
Oh, wow.
Those lobbying efforts are very attractive to a group of formerly incarcerated people who are in solitary confinement and their
Hmm.
families. So I see those people, and they're amazing people. They're very um, earnest, they're very socially committed, they have a lot of feeling for other people and wanting to help people. I think they're very healthy. I think they've made an
Hmm.
amazing adjustment after suffering
Wow.
years in solitary confinement. What I worry about is the people I don't see out in the community. The people who leave prison and they become reclusive, depressed, possibly suicidal. They stay to themselves in their home or their single room occupancy hotel, and we don't see them in the public arena. And I'm very concerned about them. They give up looking for work. They're not in relationships, a lot
Yeah.
of them, or if they are, their wives or their children are saying to me, what's happening with him? He can't talk to me about what's going on.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
how should I treat him? What should I do? And I'm worried about those people. They're the ones
Yeah, of
suffering
course.
the very serious long term effects, and they're sort of lost to follow up. The society doesn't care about them. There isn't a lot
Yeah.
of work on helping people adjust after
Yeah.
they get out of
Hmm.
prison. And they just lost. They're sort of casualties of the war.
Yeah. I mean, it's the saddest part. I hear all the time, like, why do you help these people? Why are you kind to these people? The mind's a little about reaching out to some more of the infamous names. I'm interested in more in psychopathy. Is there anything to treat that in prisons? Like, I love the Norway prison system, that incentive-based prison, which I preach is top of my lungs versus anything more negative reinforcement. But I hear, why are you always kind to these people and nice to these people? Well, as I said, the majority of people are going to get out. And my argument usually is, who do you want coming out of prison if that person is going to be your neighbor? Do you want somebody who knows compassion, love, and kindness when your little children will be walking from the bus stop past this guy's house? Or lock them up, throw away the key, I don't care, torture them, throw them in solitary. Okay, so when he comes out, maybe he went in the monster, But there's no reason they have to come out like that, let alone 3 times the person that they went in there with because of the torture and the abuse. Um, but yeah, I mean that's the biggest thing. We need the help. We need to bring awareness to it because this is why we do what we do. Because most of them are going to get out, so we need to show them that love, kindness, rehabilitation, and treatment as much as we can. It's just horrible. And I know as an expert witness, like I know you have access to go visit, to see the whole, see solitary. Can you describe, what the majority of, whether with the worst one, maybe compared, if there is such a thing as a best one? Because the one story I heard you tell was, I think his name was Willie Russell out of Mississippi. I think that was the
Yes.
guy's name, his conditions. But just speak in general about some of the conditions of that room, that cell with specific. We're not talking about mattresses and beds and curtains and, and TVs all the time. So from your firsthand experience, can you describe what they look like?
You're absolutely right, all you just said, and I will do that. Let me start with a few numbers. There's well over 2 million people in jail and prison today. It's been up to 3 million in the past, but there's some attempt to decrease the population in jails and prisons today. But now with ICE, I'm afraid it's jumping up there again. So that's a significant part of the population. So when we say lock them up and throw away the keys, and we don't want to know anything about what happens to them, we have to think a little more deeply about that because you're right. 95% of people in prison are going to go free. If we harm them with the conditions and the lack of programming and the brutality and the lack of treatment for mental health problems, the lack of substance abuse recovery programs, they're going to come out less functional than when they went in. And that's
Mm-hmm.
very dangerous for society. On the other hand, if there are two factors that correlate with post release success the strongest. One is loving connection with loved ones throughout one's entire term behind bars. People who continue their relationships with loved ones have a much lower recidivism rate. It goes down to 15%. Some
Yeah.
studies it goes to 0%, compared to 60 or 80% recidivism of people who don't have continuing loving
Mm-hmm.
relationships. The other is education. People who take part in educational programs. There are college programs that allow prisoners to do correspondence courses or send teachers into the prisons. And
Mm-hmm.
people who participate in those programs also have a much lowered recidivism rate. So I think what we need to think about seriously is what we're doing to people when they're locked behind bars going to make them more or less prone to criminality and despair after they leave prison? So
Mm-hmm.
I often get asked, this person is a heinous criminal. He killed somebody. He did this. He did that. And so shouldn't harsh treatments be used to punish him? Torture, even. And solitary confinement is torture. And my answer is the issue is not what the person did to get into prison. The issue for society is this person is going to get out of prison. Is he going to be more or less prone to horrendous antisocial acts when he gets out? If we fill his years in prison with solitary confinement, I'm afraid the problem is that he's going to be more prone to crime. He's going to have a decimation of life skills and have fewer pro-social possibilities for himself when he gets out. Versus if we fill the prison experience with education, rehabilitation, quality contact with loved ones, people are going to get out of prison
Mm-hmm.
prepared to succeed at going straight out in the community. And then the recidivism rate is going to go way down, as is the
Mm-hmm.
crime rate, and we're going to be in much better shape. Now, with that, let me just say a word about Willie Russell. That's a very good example of they say it's the worst of the worst in solitary confinement. That's far from true. It's just absolutely unfair that people in solitary confinement tend to be people of color, people who have mental illness and other physical disabilities, And people who are too smart, and
I was just going to say the highly intelligent to rub the guards the wrong way.
that's
And say,
right,
yeah, yeah.
because
Or have the power of a pen who write letters and to the outside. Oh, yeah.
that's right. Compliance is the main aim of prison staff around the country. That is, I think it's an overreaction. This person broke the law. They did what they're not supposed to do. We're going to make them very, very compliant. So we're going to give them orders about all aspects of life. And if they break rules or don't follow our orders, we're going to punish them harshly with solitary confinement. Well, what's
Mm-hmm.
going to happen is that people who think for themselves and have some respect for themselves and some integrity are going to say, wait a second, the rule that you're accusing me of violating, I did not violate it. And here's how I understand that. And they don't even get a chance to explain why
Mm-hmm.
they think they didn't violate. They get hit by an officer with a billy club and they get thrown in solitary confinement. So we find a lot of people in solitary confinement who are just very bright and very capable of thinking for themselves and think there's something terribly wrong here. For instance, solitary confinement is filled with people of color. And there are people in solitary confinement who say this is just racism.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a continuation of slavery. You've got me in solitary confinement. I've broken some rules just like everybody else, but nothing to deserve this kind of torture.
Yeah.
And when they think like that, they think for themselves, they're critical thinkers, they're going to get beaten and punished by prison staff that on average. So there's the problem. Willie Russell was on death row in Mississippi at Parchman, the Mississippi Penitentiary. Um, and there was an incident on death row where the prisoners uh, built some what they called zip guns. They were very primitive gun type of things that used rubber bands and shot projectiles. And he was blamed for it. Now, I happen to know Willie Russell. I went to see him and examined him, and I don't think he was very responsible at all. But they punished him by putting him in a dark cell,
Mm.
no lights. It was mosquito infested. This is in the swamp in the Delta in Mississippi, and the mosquitoes were coming in the window, and you could close the window and practically die or suffocate because of the humidity and the heat.
Mm.
Or if you opened, you were invaded by mosquitoes,
Yeah.
which carry diseases. There were snakes in the facility. So this
Oh.
is what the prison was. It was a solitary confinement unit, Unit 32, and they put him in a special cell because once you put someone in solitary confinement, which is an extremely harsh punishment and causes all of the psychiatric problems and pain and suffering that I mentioned, what are you going to do with them when they break a rule again? So they thought that he was the leader of this something of a prisoner rebellion, and it was really untrue. But they put him in this cell where you could not stand up. He was well over
Mm.
6 feet. I think he was
Wow.
about 6'4", and he could not stand up in his cell, so he had to be leaning over all the time. There
Mm.
were no lights. The only light you had was the food port in the solid metal door where you could look through the little hole where they pass you the food tray. Other than that, you're in total darkness. They would pass food trays into him, but it would be very inadequate food. It would be slop. It would be
Mm.
compressed leftovers from previous meals. It would often be very unhygienic. That would be his food. And he had absolutely nothing to do and was not even allowed out to do exercise. Now, the authorities in Mississippi would say he was the worst of the worst. He was leading a rebellion by people on death row. How worst of the worst can you get? But the truth is that Willie Russell, he's still there, but he's in much better circumstances because of
Oh, good.
ACLU driven lawsuit. Um, is not the worst of the worst. He's a very decent individual, very charming, very worth talking to. He has very wise things to say about a variety of subjects. But he was punished for 4 years in this very dark cell, which
Oh.
would just about break or kill anybody. He survived. We did the lawsuit. They had to stop doing that to him.
Now, somebody who I think has spent a lot more time there. I don't remember if it was in one of your books or maybe one of your lectures, but somebody the name of Robert King. I think he was out of Louisiana.
Yes.
It was something like 30 years or something, and he was like wasn't even guilty in the first place.
That is absolutely good. Good for you to read that. Robert King is in the community in New Orleans right now. He is a stunning human being. I adore him. He's very wise. Yes, he was not. He was convicted for something he didn't do. When he was convicted, he tells the story in his book. What is the name of his book? It's a wonderful book. You can look it up. Robert King. He was put in a lineup. He was just picked up off the street and put in a lineup so that they could have someone who they had good evidence had done a serious crime. It was a robbery. And the person picked him out of the lineup and said, "That's who I did the crime with." That person got convicted and was sent to prison. Robert King then went on trial for that same crime. His defense lawyer called the person who had identified him in the lineup to court as a witness. And the guy came to court, and the prosecutor was using him as a prosecution witness to prove that Robert had done the crime with him. And so the prosecutor said, "Do you know who Robert King is?" "Yes, I do." "And do you see him in the courtroom?" "Yes, I do." And he pointed to him. And the prosecutor said, "Did he do the crime with you?" Expecting him to say yes, because that's what he had said as a false kind of accusation. And this convicted person said, "No, I don't know him. I've only known him here in the court. I never met him." And the prosecutor said, "What?" and got very upset. And he said, "Well, why did you pick him out in the lineup?" He said, "I had to pick out someone or they'd have thrown me in prison for the rest of my life. So only by informing on someone was I going to get a reduced sentence. So I picked him to identify, but I didn't know him."
Yeah.
And that's how he went to prison. In prison, he became one of the Angola Three. Angola is the large prison in Louisiana. And an officer was killed in the early 80s by a prisoner. Now, I've talked to many prisoners there, and they have told me they know exactly who killed that officer. Everybody in the prison knows who killed that officer, and he's a prisoner in Angola. But the warden had it out for these three guys who had the audacity to start a Black Panther party in the prison. This is 1980.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So Robert King, along with Alex Woodfox and Herman, I forget Herman's last name, but anyway, the three of them, the warden said, "That's who did the murder. I know it. Put them in solitary confinement." And they started protesting and saying, "We didn't do this. We don't even know that guy." And there were many trials and lawsuits and such, but they kept him there. Actually, for 44 years, Albert Woodfox.
44. Oh, I had it for 30 years. That's bad enough, but 44?
44 years. Now, Robert got out because his sentence was overturned eventually. So he spent 30-some years in prison, in solitary confinement. And they
okay, maybe that's for the 30 years. Okay.
That was back in like 2009 or something, 2003, somewhere back then. And so he became a very active advocate for releasing the other two of the Angola Three. Now, Albert Woodfox would eventually get out. This was about 5 or 6 years ago, after 44 years in solitary confinement. And then he died a couple of years after he was released from prison.
Oh, wow.
These are heroic guys. They not only survived solitary confinement, they came out, they were not bitter. If you read Albert Woodfox's wonderful book called Solitary, he says, the guards come from the same culture we come from. They tend to be white, we're black, but we're poor like them, and we didn't have any real opportunities in the rural Louisiana world. So he shows a lot of sympathy, even for the guards who brutalized and tortured him. And these are remarkable men. The three of them were just so
Mm.
wise, and their writings are really worth reading.
How did they mentally? Because we talked about the mental issues that can happen from even spending the year, spending decades in there. I mean, obviously, there's I'm sure there's some kind of trauma that happened, but what did they say kept them mentally sane, through this?
That is a really interesting question. I have thought a lot about that because, as I said, I see two groups of people, and I see people in between, but there's two polar groups. One group who is just destroyed by solitary confinement. They come out of solitary and they become reclusive. They're depressed. They don't have the energy to look for work or do anything productive, and they're just miserable. And there's another group who are just incredible um, spokespeople talking
Mm.
about the harms that are done, for instance, by solitary confinement. And Robert King is one of those, as was Albert Woodbox. Um, what's the difference? Well, if you talk to Robert or Albert, and I have a video, if you look on YouTube under my name and Robert King, we
Mm.
had a conversation about the relationship between prisons and slavery, how
Mm.
prisons in the United States grew out of slavery. And he's just extremely articulate on that or any other
Wow.
subject.
Yeah.
How did he get there? How did he survive solitary and come out, as I said, not bitter and not broken? I think it has something to do with not blaming yourself for the horrible things that are done to you. Robert
Mm.
and Albert, in particular, have a very astute analysis of slavery and racism, Jim Crow, which they grew up with, and what that does to people, and how unfair it is, and how absolutely a social evil
Yeah.
slavery and racism are. And if you ask them, why are you in solitary confinement? Somewhere along the way, they'd say, because I'm black and we live in a
Yeah.
racist society. Well, it's that conviction that allows them not to criticize themselves for having gotten into this awful situation they're in. In other words, this is
Wow.
unfair. It was done to them. It's part of an oppression that they understand and struggle to end, and therefore their self-esteem is not shattered by the experience. And I think that's a key ingredient for successful um, uh, passing through solitary
Yeah.
confinement and out the other end to become a citizen out in the world again.
Now you mentioned racism, and there's a stat that I heard. I don't remember if it was from I heard from you or somebody else that if you take the world's population, say America has about 4 to 5% approximately of the world's population, but of the world's prison population, America is like I've heard it from 25% to higher. But the astounding stat that I heard is, I guess back to 1970, the prison increase in America has increased almost like sevenfold, but our crime rate hasn't seemed to jump up that same amount. But it seems like we're so many more people in prison. But let alone aside from what the rest of the world's population is, prison population, ours is 25% of the world's population. Prison population is in our prisons. But how did it skyrocket so much? It seems like the stats start from the 70s. They said sevenfold since the 70s, but the crime rate has not equaled that. It's gone up, but not to that amount. And certainly, when we talk about people of color and different minorities, is racism play into it? The third strike rule, three strikes rule. There's a lot of little things I can kind of nitpick at. But what is your perception of that? Of why? I mean, that's
Well,
not proportionally right.
you and I are on the same page with that. It is remarkable. It is 7 times. So the prison population today is 7 or 8 times what it was in 1970. The crime rate, if you follow it with accurate charts, it goes up 2% here and comes down 4% there and goes back
Yeah, it
up
goes up and down. Yeah.
3% over 5 years or a decade. So right now we're at a low nationally. The crime rate is very low right now, and COVID had a lot to do with that.
Okay.
So the, it, there's no relationship between the prison population and the crime rate. You can't argue that putting people in prison reduces crime if the crime rate hasn't gone down while the population in prison has multiplied times 7 times. So there's no relationship. It does not help the crime rate to punish people harshly. There's all kinds of research showing that. Rather, placing people in prison serves some kind of political purpose.
Mm.
What we see right now, two things about the current Trump regime. One is that the gap between the rich and poor is wider than it's ever been.
Mm.
It has been growing by leaps and bounds. And second of all, white supremacy is the law of the land. That is, get rid of DEI. Why? What's wrong with DEI? It's because the white males running the country don't like giving an opportunity, just a fair opportunity, not extra opportunity, just a fair opportunity to people of color, women, disabled people, Native Americans, gay and lesbian people. They don't want to give them a break. So what do we get? We get an awful lot of people in prison, 7 or 8 times as many as we had 50 years ago, who are people disproportionately, wildly disproportionately, people of color, gay,
Mm-hmm.
women. The proportion of women in prison has been going up steadily. So there's something about the gap between the rich and the poor and the philosophy of white supremacy that results in prisons being overfilled with people of color. Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way it works is that when you put someone in prison, there's a whole ideological superstructure to that. That is, you say, this person is a criminal. They're a terrible person, and they deserve the awful punishment that we put them in. Well, generally, people who commit crimes do that in their late teens and early 20s. Generally, they're small crimes, they're robberies or they're drug things. They might even use a gun, but they're 18 or 20 and they get a relatively short sentence. But because of what we do to them in prison, they get additional sentences for other crimes, and they end up spending an awful long time in prison. They're not the worst of the worst. Actually, they're a very ordinary group. There's some people among them that I would not want to meet in a dark alley. They're just mean.
Sure.
But there's some people who aren't in prison who are just mean. Look at who's running the government. These are not nice people. So they're ordinary people. There's a variety of people. Some of them are extremely bright. So you get someone like Albert Woodfox, who spends 44 years in solitary and writes a stunningly brilliant book. That's amazing. I don't think I'd be able to do that. So there's a range of people. Some people in prison are monsters. That's true. Some of them are in the mafia. Some of them run drugs as a living. They're a small minority, by the way. Most people in prison have been doing minor crimes when they were kids, often drug related, after having a lot of trauma earlier in their childhood.
Yeah.
That's sort of the average prisoner.
Exactly.
And they're capable of great things. I meet people who have gotten a doctorate while incarcerated and come out and serve in some professional capacity and are very stunning. There's just a variety of people in there. They're not the worst in the worst, but we need to vilify them in order to justify, for instance, putting disproportionately greater numbers of black people in prison than their representation in the population. Why do we do that? That's because they're evil people. They're heinous criminals. And so we do that. It's the same thing they've done with the murders in Minneapolis recently of the two people who basically did nothing. They were peacefully demonstrating against ICE, and they were murdered by ICE. So what does the government do? They vilify them. They say they're terrible people, they're terrorists, they're invading the community. All lies. That's nothing like that is happening. But why do they do that? They do that to justify killing them. Well, to justify putting all these people of color in prison, you have to vilify them as evil people. And that's what's been going on during this period that 7 or 8 times as many people are in prison.
Well, now, your book, Prison Madness, The Mental Health Crisis Behind Bars and What We Must Do About It, I guess that's the $1 million question. Well, not just what we can do. Obviously, we're bringing awareness to it by doing podcasts and writing books and doing lectures. But what's the solution? I mean, we talk about the politics. I mean, my view, a generic view, would be, a lot of people want to see these people punished. They committed a crime. They need to be punished. Politicians who typically, if you're high up on a political scale, you have some sway in maybe different prison facilities and things like that, or to change laws more importantly. But how do we sway the public? Because if without a big public outcry, the politicians don't seem that they're motivated to do much change, especially reform laws and judiciary laws. So it's not like it's a 2-second answer, but what's the next step? Besides bringing awareness, and it's such a massive, massive problem. How do we get people to change their minds of, no, this needs reform? I mean, Norway's doing it. North Dakota adopted a lot of Norway's prison system. California here and there, Oregon here and there. And it's great. The recidivism rate goes from like 70%, like I said, down to like below 20%. The prisons are doing this style. But it's like, we're saving money, or is it a money thing? Well, no, we want prisoners because the state's giving us money per prisoner. Is it a money thing, or is it just we need to change the laws, public perception? I know it's a loaded question with a simple answer to it, but what's the next steps? Like, what's a realistic fix?
All of that is good questions, and it's all interrelated, and it's very complex. But let me say a few things about it. What we are seeing right now is that the priority of the government under the Republican and Trump administration is to decrease taxes on the super wealthy, right? That's a main prop. End regulations so that corporations can do whatever they want if they want to dirty the water. In Flint, Michigan, the city and the locality, I think the county, took over the water system from the state. And it turns out that there were many toxic chemicals, including lead, in the water.
Yeah.
We have regulations that control the level of lead in water. They have been removed by the Trump administration so that more people, more babies, will become cognitively impaired because of lead in their water because of the end of regulations. But ending regulations is a central aim of the current administration. The demolition of social welfare safety net programs, I'm talking about public health, public mental health, breakfast, preschool and breakfast for low-income children, nutritional supplements, all of those things are being wiped out. Why? There's absolutely no rational reason to do that. All of those things support a healthy society. And it's my view, and then we're getting into politics here, but my view is that the role of government is to support the most disadvantaged among us because it's not profitable for anybody else to offer that support. But for instance, housing. Why do we have so many people unhoused in this society? We're the richest country in the world. Why not develop programs which wouldn't cost anywhere near what it costs to stop taxes for the super wealthy? That is putting us in a deficit much more than any kind of supported housing program would do. But if we would supply some kind of supported housing, we would help people who are down and out to become productive citizens and help with the general good. So what we need is, to be very brief about it, massive reduction of the prison population. We need decriminalizing. We need to reform sentencing. We need to improve our bail system so that nowhere near as many people. We need to go the other direction. Instead of 7 or 8 times as many people in prison, we need to go to 1/10, 1/100th of the people we've got in prison and get the rest of the people trained so that they can go out in society and succeed. That's what we need. Now, for people with mental illness, one of the little sub-dramas that is part of my life and my career choices is that when I first went into the jails and prisons and saw untreated mental illness like I had not seen, I'd read about it in the asylums of the 40s and 50s before we had psychotropic medications, that people were just entirely bizarre. They were psychotic, they were screaming, they were irrational in the jails and prisons. And I asked myself, what's going on here? This was in the 1970s. I had been trained to that we take people who have serious mental illness, put them in a hospital, and treat them. And that's what I was learning how to do. And here I see them in jail, untreated and suffering immensely and making life impossible for everybody else. Why was that? Well, one of the reasons was that we were cutting the public mental health budget. Under President Kennedy, we had the Community Mental Health Centers Act, and the federal government, funded community mental health centers all over the country in all the little local areas. And those funds were cut as part of the neoliberal strategy to reduce the social safety net welfare programs. Now we had a whole lot of people who were deinstitutionalized, and that was not the problem. It wasn't that they were released from the hospital. It's that they had no services when they got in the community because the funding was successively cut by increments over the next 30 or 40 years from the 1970s. And that then made them vulnerable to be unhoused, to be using drugs, and to get arrested and go to prison. Yeah. And prison, the same budget cuts that reduced the public mental health clinical capacity was also in effect in the jails and prisons, so that notoriously in jails and prisons there is mental health care, but it's inadequate. It's very thin, and people who have serious mental illness are going to do much worse if they go to prison than they would otherwise.
Yeah. Is it a money thing when somebody not even know, to be mentally competent to stand trial, knowing right from wrong? I know people with severe mental illness, they know right from wrong, but they are clearly, mentally unstable. Is it a financial thing, knowing that they should be in a mental institution for their wellness? Is it different from public outcry? Like I just had somebody on the podcast done horrible things to people. He said he started out for a couple years at a mental health facility with a couple people he was housed with currently now. He says, at the 2 years that I was at the mental health facility, and this is somebody who's like, it's not just schizophrenic, he's delusional, hallucinatory. I mean, he lives in a different reality, let's say. And he said there was no crime. There was no fights. There was no arguments. The same group of people, including himself, who's committed murders once he got into prison, that's really mental illness. It's fights. There's violence. For, I think, almost 3 years, nothing. No violence or getting treatment or a kindness. And he says, I would just like somebody to talk to. When I'm about to have an episode, we can't because it's not fair to everybody else. You can only do group meetings with therapy. And right after that, he took somebody's life, because all in all I wanted somebody to talk to.
Yes.
So is it a financial thing or is it a public outcry where they need to be in a mental institute? They need this proper help. But no, lock away, throw them away the key, just throw them in there. I mean, is it a financial thing at all with that, or is it just laws need to change?
Well, that's a good question, and there's a whole lot of issues wrapped into that. It is true that money needs to change hands if proper programming is to occur. However, it's always less expensive to do the proper programming than to deal with the fallout of the improper programming. So take someone with a serious mental illness who's inclined, when they're, for instance, in a psychotic state, to break the law and maybe hurt someone. Although, people with mental illness are much more often the victims of violence than the perpetrators. But there are some that perpetrate, unfortunately. Yeah. It costs money to provide good quality mental health treatment to people with the most serious mental illnesses. That is true. But that is less money than it costs, for instance, a city and county when they're unhoused on the street and getting into trouble. Yeah. If that's more expensive than the relatively small amount of money it would take to provide them adequate mental health treatment, along with housing, whether that means an inpatient facility or just supported housing where they can be comfortable and not being in the freezing weather and not subject to victimization out in the street.
Yeah.
If we did that, it would cost something, but it would cost less than if we do nothing and then wait for them to show up in the emergency room and take up all kinds of doctors and nurses' time, go to jail and cost a fortune to house in the jail, to pay the staff, etc., to pay the lawsuits about the inhuman care that happens in the jail. The proper treatment would cost a lot less than the denial of that treatment. You mentioned North Dakota. North Dakota is one of the states, and there are many, California and Oregon is certain among them, Colorado, Washington, who have emulated the Norwegian approach to the legal system. And that is that they don't put so many people in prison. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
The Scandinavian countries have a lot fewer people in prison, and the reason is because they offer people who break the law programs, either substance abuse programs, mental health treatment programs, re-education, vocational training, out in the community before they lock them up.
Yeah.
And so,
Wasn't California? Is that what was it called, the diversion program or something like that? That California
yes,
had? I think was that something similar, right?
yes, we have that in California, but it's all over the country. And that is,
Mm.
and it's more for minor crimes, but I think it would work
Okay.
for major crimes too. And that is, there's special courts set up called behavioral health courts or substance abuse courts, where the judge has the authority to say, this person does not belong behind bars. If we would get them treatment, they would be law abiding citizens and
Yeah.
productive human beings. And therefore, I'm going to assign them to a program in the community that's called diversion. And that program in the community will report back to me about how they do. If they do not take part in the program, the judge is going to call them into court and say, look, I gave you a break. I said you don't have to go to jail if you go to this program and do what they ask you to do. You're not doing it. Why should I not send you to jail now? And people will say, oh, Your Honor, you're absolutely right. I will do it now. And the judge says something like this. I'm going to give you one more chance. You go out there and you take part in that program, and I don't want to see you back here. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll do it. And an awful lot of people do what the judge ordered. They get their act together and they become productive citizens. That's a diversion. That's one way to reduce the population, prison population. There are many ways. Bail reform would do it. The only reason people are in jail before they're tried
Before a trial,
is they don't have money to afford bail. So wealthy people wait at home to go to court if they're charged with a crime. But poor people spend their time in jail where there's incredible stress, including solitary confinement. They fall apart. They are not as competent to defend themselves in court. It's a terrible system. And if we would have more fair bail, so it's not someone's ability to afford bail that decides whether they spend time in jail before they're convicted. And we would do diversion, robust diversion, and we would do sentence reform so that people who have done relatively minor crimes don't have to spend 8 or 10 years in prison. If we would do those few things, which wouldn't cost much, we would massively reduce the jail and prison population. We would increase the proportion of people who are productive citizens, and the situation would be much, much improved, and it wouldn't have cost us anything because all of those measures are less expensive than what happens when people fall and fail.
Yeah. I mean, here in the local South Jersey, Philadelphia area, I'm part of an organization called Seeds of Hope. And it helps with women on the streets, that from prostitution or addicts, whatever it may be. And I'm part of the men's side, South Jersey Aftercare, where we bought numerous houses in the Camden area, which is, not the greatest, place in the world. It never ceases to amaze me just how much kindness, unconditional love to complete strangers. Now, it's a mostly African American place. I'm like the whitest of the white guys you're going to see. But just from me, it took a while to break through walls then. But when they see me come into a dangerous part of town over and over again for months and months, going into a facility or some allowed out of facility or guys just getting out of prison, the most success stories that we have Or just that. They come into our housing. You got to follow our rules. We take care of your money. We get you a job. Now, it might be the recycling plant, but you got a job. You got to help feed the homeless. It's a faith-based program. So, go to church once a week or so, a couple times a month. But just them or feedback for them saying, no one has ever cared about me. My family has just abandoned me. I never knew my father. Most of it, at least for the men in this area here, I'm sure anywhere, the lack of a father figure. And they search for the father figure on the streets, the gang leader, the drug leader, and they're just using the kid, of course, to help them, facilitate their drugs, whatever. But it seems like as a nation, from politically to any aspect of it, if we just had a bigger heart, like actually cared about there are human beings. Yes, there's some illnesses might not be reversible, but most people, I believe, can change. I've seen miracles happen to people you'd be scared of. Now you will let this guy babysit your kid, get education. Now they have degrees. They're holding great jobs. It all starts, in my opinion, it doesn't have to be faith-based, but caring, showing unconditional love. And I always joke about, we did look at dogs more. We learned more about unconditional love from a dog, than we can, I think, from anybody else out here. We're, completely faithful, love us unconditionally. But that's the thing, if we actually cared about them, their well-being, who they can potentially be in the future, I think that's like the foundation of thing where we all need to start. But it's amazing. I mean, well, first I just want to say thank you, for sharing this. I mean, we could do a podcast once a week and still not scratch the surface of everything that needs to be talked about.
That's
right.
What you're saying is right on, and that is a little caring, compassion rather than vengeance, which is what rules now.
Yeah.
But if it would be a little bit of compassion, particularly for disadvantaged people, a little mutual respect. If people show someone respect and they tend to behave better. That is just generally true. What we have is a police and prison system that makes crime worse. What we do to people in jail and prison makes them more prone to repeat their illegal activity later on, for instance, after they're released. And it wouldn't cost very much to do the kind of things they're doing in North Dakota or some of the other states that are doing more in the way of rehabilitation. If you in a prison, if you give people meaningful jobs, if you say, look, I'm going to teach you how to weld, and when you get out of prison, you can get a good job welding, and you don't have to steal.
Yeah.
You are not going to have fights in prison. Not many. I mean, you always have something, but a much less violence in prison because people are not prone to sacrifice the project they're involved in, which is going to help them succeed in the future. And that's true across the board. So just with a little bit of investment in the rehabilitation, giving people the skills so that they can do work that they will be proud of themselves for doing is going to reverse crime, because people go to prison on average. There's many exceptions in all directions, but on average, people go to prison as youngsters. They don't know what they're doing. When I talk to them after they've been in prison for 20 or 30 years and I interview them, and they say, I was a stupid kid. I shouldn't have been doing drugs. I shouldn't have been doing those crimes. I was ripping and running, and I didn't know what I was doing. And I'm talking to someone who's a very thoughtful, well-schooled, they've educated themselves in the library and reading, and they can be a productive citizen. But in the cases where they have these horribly long sentences for doing very little, they just have no hope of getting out of prison and having a productive life. But they're certainly capable of having a productive life, and we could change the rules so that we give them a chance.
Well, I could talk to you all night. So I appreciate your time. And we haven't even scratched the surface, like not this topic, but we didn't even get into women's prison facilities yet. And I got friends at Chowchilla in California where they have a condom machine now in the bathroom. So there's so many problems, So hopefully one day in the near future, I'll have you on again and we'll talk another topic. Like I said, every week we could be on here and still something for us to talk about. Sadly, something new to bring awareness to, but again, thank you for everything that you do. Like I said, every time I do research, your name is always on top of the list. So I've been reading about you for a while, from your books to your lectures. I really appreciate you taking a few moments for us. And I hope, this will be a blessing to open up people's eyes and ears to, it doesn't take much change. Like we can do it. This is not a miracle type of a thing. It can be done. It can happen fairly quickly if everybody gets on the same page and realizes we have a problem. It's not getting any better. It's getting worse drastically, but it can be reversed and quickly if we just pull together and get on the same page about this. It's not an irreversible thing.
Absolutely. We know how to treat serious mental illness, but we often do not have the resources. So the people with the most severe mental illness are unhoused, and they feel attacked by the clinics that we set up to treat them.
Yeah.
We could reverse that. We know how to do that. We just don't have the funding because of social priorities, which at the moment are very messed up. So it's a pleasure. I'd be delighted and honored to come back again, and it's a pleasure to talk with you.
I appreciate it. Thanks again. You have a great night. All right. Well, there you go. I'm so happy. I mean, so many emotions. Like, I'm happy to have somebody like Dr. Terry who agreed to come on. I was surprised he said yes. He's very busy. So it was great to have him on. So I'm happy about that. I'm devastated. I mean, I've been involved in prison aftercare my whole life, so I'm aware of all this. But to really hear from that inside point of view, who's somebody who's visited multiple facilities, and obviously I have a lot of people from prison who call the show, who spent time in solitary, but not decades, 30 years, 40 years in solitary. It's heartbreaking. Encouraging to think that there is hope. There is hope for change, that we can do something about it. What can you do about it? I mean, I don't know. Everybody has a different part to play. I play my part in helping out and volunteering. You can write people to encourage them. If you're religious, you can pray. Something. So keep Dr. Terry in your thoughts and prayers as he has a busy schedule, testifying around the country in numerous cases. So keep him in your thoughts and prayers. Check out his books, again, Ending Isolation, the new one, The Case Against Solitary Confinement, Prison Madness, The Mental Health Crisis Behind Bars and What We Must Do About It, and Solitary, The Inside Story of Supermax Isolation and How We Can Abolish It. Check it out on Amazon. Do some research, listen to his lectures. Again, you give him a couple of videos he mentioned online to check out. Very, very important. Again, we barely scratched the surface of this. It's awesome. I think we had a great conversation. I think he'd enjoy himself. It looks like he'll come back on. We have so many different topics to talk about. But, yeah, it's a start, to bring that awareness out there. So I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, see ya.